I've been trying to figure out how to tell this story for about 4 months now. I've started it maybe a dozen times in my head, on paper, once into a voice recorder at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and thought getting it out might help. It didn't help, but I think I need to tell it anyway, because telling it is the only version of documentation I have left, and documentation is the only thing I know how to do anymore. My name is Callum Voss. I'm 26 years old, and last October, my Uncle Joel got me a seasonal posting at a backcountry ranger station in the Great Smoky Mountains, a place called Desolate Ridge, and left the same week I arrived. I want to be careful about how I describe that morning, because it matters. Not the dramatic parts, the small parts. Joel had been at that station for 3 years. He knew every cabinet, every frequency, every quirk of the hand pump well that ran slow in cold weather. He knew the fire road's bad spots where the gravel washed out after rain, where a low branch would catch your mirror if you drifted left. He knew this place the way you know somewhere you've lived alone for a long time, which is a specific kind of knowing that goes into your body rather than your memory. And he packed his truck in 40 minutes. I watched him do it. He was efficient in a way that felt rehearsed, like he'd packed that truck in his head 100 times before he actually did it. No hesitation, no second trips. He didn't walk through the cabin one last time the way people do when they're leaving somewhere that meant something to them. He just came off the porch, crossed to where I was standing by my own truck, and pressed a folded index card into my palm. No envelope, no explanation. His hand was cold from the morning air, and his grip was brief and firm. And he looked at me for just a second longer than normal before he said, "Follow these." That was it. I looked down at the card. When I looked back up, he was already in his truck. His taillights disappeared around the first bend of the fire road, and the sound of his engine dropped away fast. The mountain took it, the way the mountain takes everything up there, folding it into the general quiet like it was never there. I stood in the gravel and unfolded the card. Joel's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who spent years filling out field reports in the rain with one hand. The card was an index card, the 4x6 kind, and he had filled both sides. 7 rules, numbered, no headers, no explanations, no dates. I'm going to read them to you exactly as they appeared, because I think the plainness of them is part of it. There was nothing theatrical about the way they were written. They read like a checklist, like something practical. Rule 1. Do not leave the station between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. for any reason. If you hear someone calling for help during those hours, log the direction and time. Do not go outside. Rule 2. If a hiker arrives after dark asking to use the radio, let them in, give them water, but do not let them stand behind you. Position yourself between them and the door at all times. Rule 3. The equipment shed is to be locked by sundown every day. If you arrive in the morning and the lock is open but unbroken, do not go inside. Radio the district office and wait outside the shed until someone arrives. Rule 4. The radio repeater tower makes a clicking sound during normal operation. If the clicking stops, go to the main cabin immediately and do not speak out loud until it starts again. Rule 5. If you find trail markers, that have been repositioned, turned to face a wrong direction. Do not correct them. Photograph them, log the coordinates, and return to the station. Do not follow any trail that has been redirected this way. Rule 6. There is a guest log on the front desk. Every visitor must sign it. If someone refuses to sign, do not argue. Write their description in the log yourself after they leave. If their description does not match any entry made before or after them, flag the page with a red tab. Rule 7. On your last night before rotation, leave the porch light on. Do not turn it off, regardless of what you see in the light. I read them twice, standing in the gravel, with the morning cold coming off the ridge, and the card trembling slightly in my hands from the altitude wind. Then I folded it, put it in my breast pocket, and went inside. The cabin was clean. That was the first thing. Not clean the way a place gets when someone tidies before leaving. Clean the way a place gets when someone has been preparing to leave for a long time. When the cleaning isn't a final gesture, but an ongoing one. Incremental. A little more each week until there's nothing left to remove. Joel's personal items were gone. His coffee mug, the chipped blue one, I remembered from every visit I'd ever made, gone. His rain gear hook by the door, empty. The small photograph he kept taped to the inside of the radio cabinet, the one of him and my father from some fishing trip in the 90s, gone, leaving a small rectangle of slightly less faded wood where it had been. What remained was all institutional. The radio log binder, the trail map set in its protective sleeve, the visitor log on the front desk, open to the current page, the gear inventory clipboard, the emergency contact laminate, the weather observation notebook, all of it exactly where it should be. All of it without any trace of Joel, except that he had been the one to leave it there. I did a slow walk through the cabin, the way you do on your first day of any posting, not searching for anything, just building the map of the place in your body. Main room, radio station against the north wall, 2-burner propane stove, table with 4 chairs, though there was no reason for 4 chairs. The bunk room off the back, with 2 bunks and 1 window facing the tree line. The bathroom composting system, no running water for anything except the hand pump cold line at the kitchen sink. Small, functional, isolated in the specific way that high-elevation backcountry stations are isolated, which is different from being far from people. You can be far from people in a lot of places and not feel it. Up here, at 4,400 feet, with the tree line pressing in 20 feet from the cabin walls and the nearest structure 7 miles down a fire road, you feel it immediately. The isolation has weight. I came back through the main room and stopped at the front door. The porch light was on, full midday brightness outside, and the porch light burning. I reached up and touched the bulb casing with 2 fingers. Warm. Not from the morning sun. Warm from hours of burning. I looked at the card in my breast pocket. I looked at Rule 7. I didn't connect them yet. I told myself Joel had simply forgotten to turn it off. I left it burning. I don't know why. I want to explain what the job actually is, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. A backcountry ranger station isn't a visitor center. There's no gift shop, no interpretive signage, no parking lot. It's a working post a point of human presence in a section of park that would otherwise have none. The ranger's job is documentation, enforcement, and emergency response, roughly in that order of frequency and roughly in reverse order of importance. Documentation means trail condition reports filed twice weekly, weather observations logged at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., wildlife incident notes, visitor contact sheet signed whenever you make contact with a permitted backcountry user. It means keeping the radio log current, maintaining the gear inventory, and reporting any infrastructure issues, downed trees on maintained trails, damaged boundary markers, erosion on the fire road. Enforcement means checking backcountry permits, verifying bear canister compliance, and occasionally having the conversation with an underprepared hiker about why they need to turn around. It means boundary marker maintenance, making sure the closure signs at the fire road gate are legible, and logging any violations even when you can't do much about them in the moment. Emergency response means SAR support when something goes wrong in your sector. In practice, for a single ranger at a remote station, it usually means being the first radio relay point while you wait for a team to come up the mountain. That's the job. It's real work. There's always something to document, always something to check, always a reason to be out on the trails by 8 in the morning and back at the station by 5. I walked the station perimeter that first afternoon and took notes. The shed was locked combination padlock, the combination written on a card taped inside the main cabin's kitchen cabinet. The repeater tower stood 20 yards north of the cabin, a treated post with the antenna array at about 15 feet, and the equipment box at the base, and it clicked. A soft, irregular clicking that I barely noticed at first, the way you don't notice a clock until the room gets quiet enough. The tree line was close. I measured it by pacing 18 feet from the cabin's north wall to the nearest trunk. That's not unusual for a ridgetop installation, but standing next to the cabin and looking at the trees, it felt close. They came right up to the edge of the cleared area and stopped, and the cleared area wasn't much. I pulled the trail map set and oriented myself. Ridge spine running northeast to southwest. 2 hollows, one to the south, one to the north. The south hollow appeared on the current map with a dotted trail line running into it and back. The north hollow wasn't labeled. I looked at the older USGS topographic in the back of the map sleeve. There it was. Cutter's Hollow, penciled in the old style, with no trail markings and a contour pattern that suggested it was steep-sided and deep. I assumed it was a cartographic update, a name retired from official use. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. The 1900 radio check-in was standard procedure. Twice daily, 700 and 1900, every day of the posting. I keyed the handset at 6:58 and waited for the district frequency to clear. Desolate Ridge to district, radio check, over. A pause, longer than I expected. District copies, Desolate Ridge. Go ahead. The voice was a woman's, professional, flat, not unfriendly, the voice of someone running a quiet evening shift. I gave her my call sign, confirmed my first full day on station, reported no visitor contacts, no trail incidents, no weather events. Standard check-in content. She logged it, read it back, and I confirmed. Then I waited for the normal follow-up. The how did handover go question? Or any questions for your first week? Or even just good luck up there? Some version of human acknowledgement that someone new was starting a solo posting at a remote station. She said, "Copy all, Desolate Ridge. Next check-in at 0700, district out." And she was gone. I held the handset for a moment before setting it down. It wasn't rude, exactly. Some duty officers ran tight check-ins. But she hadn't asked about Joel. Not a single question. Not whether he was already gone. Not whether the handover had been smooth. Not whether he'd left the station in good order. Nothing? I thought about that pause before she answered. The way it stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, like she'd been checking something before responding. I told myself I was reading into it. New posting nerves. Silence always sounds significant in the mountains when you're alone. But I picked up the index card from the table and read Rule 1 again before I went to bed. I read through the current season visitor log that first night, out of professional habit, more than anything else. It was something to do with my hands, while the propane stove ticked through its cool-down cycle, and the repeater clicked its irregular rhythm outside. 15 entries since the season opened in late September. Dates, names, permit numbers, entry points, planned routes. All of it written in different hands the visitors had signed themselves in, which was correct procedure, and all of it routine. Day hikers, a couple of permitted overnight groups, one solo backpacker who had come through 3 times on a section hike. I turned the pages slowly, reading each entry the way you read a new post's records, looking for anything that needed follow-up, any discrepancy between the permit and the actual route recorded. On the 8th page, I stopped. The page had 3 entries on it. The top 2 were normal. The bottom entry was a clean, straight edge where a 4th entry should have been not torn, not smudged, cut. Someone had cut the bottom entry from the page with something sharp, a knife or a box cutter, leaving a strip of paper about an inch wide still bound into the spine. I turned to the next page. Same thing. A cut entry. And the page after that, another one. 3 pages total. 3 removed entries, all cut cleanly. Old cuts. The paper edges had yellowed slightly at the cut line. I sat with that for a while. It could have been administrative, a permit correction, a duplicate entry removed for the official record. These things happened. But the cuts were done from the inside of the log. Not a page removed entirely, just the entry stripped away while leaving the page itself intact. That was a specific choice. Someone had wanted to remove the content and leave the structure. I closed the log, stacked it neatly on the front desk, and went to bed. At 11:04 p.m., I heard something, faint, from the north. A voice. I thought it was a voice, and then the wind shifted, and it was gone, and I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the repeater click, and telling myself it was distance hikers, or wind through the hollow, or the particular way this ridge carried sound from the valley miles below. I didn't get up. I didn't go to the window. I don't know if that was the rules working before I'd understood them, or just being tired. The second morning was clear. The kind of clear that only happens in the southern Appalachians in late October, when the humidity finally drops, and the air gets a particular quality, thin and bright, and smelling of cold leaf decay, of wet bark and altitude, and something faintly sweet that I've never been able to name. I was on the trail by 7:45. I want to say something about what the Smokies look like in that last week of October, because I think you need to understand it, to understand how a person could stay in a place where things kept happening that should have sent them down the mountain. The canopy was at peak, not quite turned, not quite dropped. That perfect window when the whole ridge is burning orange and rust and a deep, almost burgundy that you don't see at lower elevations. The trail caught the early sun at an angle that made the gravel steam slightly where it was still wet from overnight dew. The hollow to my south was filled with mist at that hour, the kind of slow-rolling fog that sits in hollows like water and burns off by 10. It was beautiful in the way that the mountains are sometimes beautiful, not like a postcard, but like something that doesn't particularly care whether you're there to see it. I did the main ridge trail first, 4 miles out and back, and made contact with 2 permitted backpackers heading toward the southern shelter site. I checked their permits, verified their bear canisters, noted the contact on their sheet. They were a couple from Knoxville mid-40s, experienced, well-equipped. They asked about weather, and I gave them the forecast. Normal interaction, the kind of brief, practical exchange that ranger work is mostly made of. What I noticed, and filed without flagging, was the sound. On that ridge, at that elevation, sound arrived wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly. The backpackers' voices reached me about 1.5 seconds after their mouths moved, like a film where the audio sync is slightly off. My own boots on gravel produced an echo that came back from a direction that didn't correspond to any rock face or slope. A woodpecker somewhere in the canopy sounded like it was directly behind me, and when I turned, the sound shifted to my left. I knew ridgetop sound propagation did strange things. I'd worked enough elevation to know that. I filed it as atmospheric and kept walking. The North Ridge spur split off the main trail at a junction marked by a 4x4 post with a green arrow disc and a mileage number. Standard park signage, the kind I'd seen on every trail I'd ever worked. I took the spur for a boundary check. There was a series of boundary markers along the northeast property line that needed visual inspection per the station's standard patrol rotation. The spur was narrower than the main trail, less maintained, more leaf debris. Nobody had been through there recently. I found the marker about 300 yards in. It was a standard directional post-green disc, white arrow. It was supposed to face outward, pointing back toward the main trail junction, guiding hikers on their return route. It was turned approximately 45 degrees off its correct facing, not pointing toward Cutter's Hollow, yet just wrong, misaligned. The kind of thing that could be casual vandalism or a hiker grabbing it for balance and rotating it without noticing. I reached out and corrected it before I thought about it. 3 seconds of work. Post back to correct facing. Done. Then I remembered Rule 5. I stood there with my hand still on the post, which I had already touched, already moved. Rule 5 said, do not correct them. Photograph them, log the coordinates, and return to the station. I took out my phone and photographed the marker correctly positioned now, because I'd moved it. The photograph was useless as documentation of an anomaly. I logged the coordinates anyway, and when I wrote up the patrol notes back at the station that evening, I noted the marker as found in correct position. No action required. That was a small dishonesty. I knew it when I wrote it. I told myself it didn't matter, because the marker was probably just vandalism, and I'd corrected it, and that was the right call, regardless of what an index card said. I've thought about that small dishonesty a lot since then, about how the first compromise is always easy to explain. I was back at the station by 4:30 and on the porch by 5 with a cup of coffee and nothing particular to do until the 1900 check-in. That was when I started really hearing the repeater. It had been there since I arrived. A soft, irregular clicking from the equipment box at the base of the tower. The sound of a relay cycling, normal operation. But sitting on the porch in the late afternoon quiet, with the canopy color deepening as the light dropped and the mist starting to rise again in the north hollow, I found myself timing it. The clicks came in clusters, 2 or 3, in quick succession. Then a gap of 4 to 8 seconds. Then another cluster. Not quite regular enough to be mechanical. Not quite irregular enough to be random. I sat with it for 20 minutes and couldn't find the pattern, which meant either the pattern was more complex than I could track, or the variation was wide enough that it only felt like a pattern. I read Rule 4 again. The radio repeater tower makes a clicking sound during normal operation. If the clicking stops, go to the main cabin immediately and do not speak out loud until it starts again. I filed the clicking as baseline. I would learn its rhythm so I'd know when it changed. That felt like a rational, professional response to an irrational rule. The 1900 check-in was routine. A different duty officer male this time, who was slightly warmer, but still brief. He asked about trail conditions. I reported. He signed off. I made dinner. At 11:04 p.m., I noted the time later, after a voice came from the north. Not words, or not words I could make out. A voice-shaped sound at the edge of audibility, somewhere in the direction of Cutter's Hollow, lasting maybe 20 seconds before the wind shifted, and it was gone. I sat at the table. I looked at Rule 1. I picked up the log and wrote, 23:09 hours. Possible voice contact, north-northwest, bearing approximately 340 degrees. Duration approximately 20 seconds. Did not exit station. No further activity. Then I closed the log and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the repeater click. It clicked steadily until I went to bed. I was grateful for the sound in a way I didn't fully understand yet. I was asleep when it started. Deeply asleep, the altitude sleep you get in the first week at elevation. Heavy and dreamless. And then I was sitting up in the dark with my feet on the cold floor before I understood what had pulled me out of it. A voice. From outside. From the north. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. The voice was saying my name. Not hello, not help me, not the general distress call of someone lost in the dark. My name. Callum. Calm, even, patient, like someone speaking to a person they knew was listening. Like someone who had been doing this long enough to know that patience worked better than urgency. I sat on the edge of the bunk and made myself breathe. The voice was Joel's. Not like Joel's. Not similar to Joel's in the way that fear makes things similar. It was the specific texture of his voice, the slight flatness of his vowels, the East Tennessee accent he'd carried his whole life, the particular way he said my name, with the stress landing just slightly earlier than most people would put it. I got up. I walked to the main room in my socks. I looked at Rule 1 on the index card, which I had started leaving on the table rather than in my pocket, because I was reading it more than I expected to. Do not leave the station between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. for any reason. If you hear someone calling for help during those hours, log the direction and time. Do not go outside. I sat down at the table. I picked up the log. 02:17 hours. Voice contact, north-northwest, bearing 340 degrees. Voice calling subject's name. Vocal quality. Male. Familiar. Duration. Ongoing. I set down the pen and listened. The voice was not desperate. It did not escalate to shouting. It called my name at intervals of roughly 30 seconds, not so frequent that it felt frantic, not so spaced that it felt uncertain. It called like something that had measured the interval and decided that one was correct, like something that understood pacing. I sat at that table for 1 hour and 34 minutes. I logged the end time, 3:51 a.m. The voice stopped as gradually as it had started. The last call was slightly quieter, the way a sound gets when its source moves away rather than stops. I did not go outside. I did not sleep again that night. I sat at the table and looked at the north wall of the cabin and thought about how the voice had known my name before I thought about any of the other things. And that was the thought that stayed with me through to morning. I called it in at 0700 exactly. I was professional about it. I delivered the normal check-in content first: trail report, weather, visitor contacts. Then I said I needed to log an incident from overnight. I described it. Voice from the north, bearing 340, duration 1 hour, 34 minutes, calling my name. Vocal characteristics consistent with a known male individual. No visual contact. Did not exit station per operational protocol. The duty officer, a man I hadn't spoken to before, older sounding, deliberate. Let me finish. Then he was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone pulling up a form or finding a pen. A different kind of pause. Did you go outside? He asked. No. Another pause, shorter. Good. Log it and continue your duties. I waited for more. A follow-up question. A wildlife explanation. Some parks had documented cases of certain primate vocalizations carrying strangely at altitude, though this wasn't that kind of terrain. Or a request to file a formal incident report. Something. Is there a SAR protocol I should? Log it, he said again. Continue your duties. Next check-in at 1900. District out. The frequency went quiet. I sat with the handset in my lap and the static hiss of the open channel filling the cabin. Then I set it in the cradle. He had not asked what name the voice used. He had not asked whether I recognized the voice, or whether I thought it was a distressed hiker, or whether I needed a welfare check. The first question out of his mouth was whether I had gone outside, which meant the outside was the concern, not the voice, not whoever or whatever had been producing it. He already knew about the voice, or about voices, or about whatever happened in the dark hours on this ridge in a way that made "Did you go outside?" the only thing that needed to be asked. The institution knew. The institution had always known. And the institution had sent me up here anyway, with a card in my pocket and a porch light that was already burning when I arrived. I went back to the log and added a note to the overnight entry. 4 words, under the end time. District office was unsurprised, 6 days into the posting. The evening had been quiet, clear sky, temperatures dropping fast after sundown, the repeater clicking its steady, irregular rhythm outside. I'd finished my notes, done the 1900 check-in, and was reading at the table when the knock came. 3 knocks, measured, at the front door. I checked my watch before I moved. 9:40 p.m. Late for a visitor, not impossible. Lost hikers came in after dark sometimes, and the station light was visible from the main trail on clear nights. I opened the door. She was mid-30s, maybe, with a torn rain jacket and mud on her boots up to the ankle, and a headlamp with batteries that were clearly dying. The beam was orange-yellow instead of white, throwing maybe 10 feet of useful light. She was breathing hard. She'd been moving. "I'm sorry," she said. "I got separated from my group on the North Ridge spur. I need to use the radio." I stepped back to let her in. "Come on inside. Are you hurt?" "No, just, I need the radio." I let her in. I gave her water. And then I remembered Rule 2. I moved the chair. Casually, I picked it up and set it down on the other side of the table, the side closer to the door, and I sat in it, so that she was between me and the back of the cabin, and I was between her and the exit. She noticed. She didn't comment on it, but she noticed. Her eyes went to the chair, then to me, then to the room. A small recalibration. The moment I registered that she'd noticed, something in me went cold and steady. Not frightened, just focused in the particular way you get focused when your body has decided something before your brain has finished arguing about it. "The radio's right over there," I said, and nodded toward the north wall. "Whenever you're ready." She sat across from me, wrapped both hands around the water bottle, and said, "Thank you. I just need a minute." We talked for 40 minutes. Everything she said was correct. She knew the trail, junction, the exact mileage marker, the way the spur branched left, the blowdown across the trail at the quarter-mile point that I'd logged in my own patrol notes. She described her group leader by name, and I had the permit in the binder, and the name matched. She described her tent, her pack color, the shelter site they were heading for. She knew the shelter site's name, its distance from the junction, the spring location near it. Her story was airtight. It had the texture of real experience, the specific details that you can't invent if you haven't been somewhere. She'd been on that trail today. And in 40 minutes of conversation, she hadn't moved toward the radio. She'd accepted the water. She'd answered my questions. She'd asked about the trail conditions between here and the shelter site, and listened carefully to my answer. She'd looked at the topo map I laid on the table and traced the route with her finger, and said, "That makes sense." She had not taken a single step toward the radio. At 10:22 p.m., I said, "The radio's right there whenever you're ready." I gestured at it directly this time, not just a nod. She looked at the radio. A full look, not a glance. Then she looked back at me. "I think I'll wait until morning," she said. "If that's okay. I'm more tired than I thought." I showed her the bunk room. I gave her a spare blanket. I told her morning check-in was at 7. She thanked me. She went in, and I heard her sit on the bunk. I went back to the table and positioned the chair so I could see both the bunk room doorway and the front door. I did not sleep. I sat in the dark with the lamp off because the lamp would make me visible through the windows, and I wanted to see out, not be seen through. I sat there all night thinking about the fact that she had come specifically to use the radio and had not used the radio, and that her reason for not using the radio was that she was tired, and that the reason that was wrong was not something I could have articulated to anyone outside this situation. But I knew it was wrong, the way you know when a step is going to creak before it does. At 5:50 a.m., I woke up with my cheek on the table and the lamp still off, and gray light coming through the east window. The bunk room was empty. The spare blanket was folded at the foot of the bunk. The front door was unlocked from inside, which meant she'd unlocked it herself to leave, which meant she'd walked through the main room while I was unconscious at the table, and I hadn't heard it. I checked the door. No damage. No forced mechanism. The lock turned smoothly. I sat down at the table and opened the visitor log. She had signed in when I'd asked her to, the night before. Her entry was there, her name, the date, the time, 9:52 p.m., her permit number, her signature. Below it, on the same page, in a different handwriting controlled, small, vertical, was a second entry. Same date, same time, different name, or rather, no name. The name field contained a dash. The permit field was blank. The physical description field was filled in with neat, careful detail. Height, approximate weight, hair color, jacket color, gait pattern, condition of boots. A precise physical description of the woman I had been speaking to for 40 minutes. The face field, a column I added myself to the log on day 1, for visitor contact descriptions, said 4 words. Did not look directly at. I turned to the front of the log to check the column headers. The face column was there, in my handwriting, the way I'd set it up. It was my column. The second entry had used my column. And below the face field entry, at the bottom of the second entry, in that same small handwriting, a blank line, nothing else. I read Rule 6. I found a red tab in the supply drawer. I tabbed the page. Then I sat very still for a while, with my hands flat on the table, and the gray morning light coming through the windows, and the repeater clicking outside. And I thought, it knows the protocol. Her name was in the personnel binder under previous station operators' reference contacts. Diane Morrow, Desolate Ridge Station, 1998 to 2010. Current posting, District Administration, Desk Assignment. I reached her on an off-channel frequency during the midday window when district traffic was light. I explained who I was, that I was the current Desolate Ridge operator, that I was calling because I had some questions about station protocols. There was a pause. Which protocols? She asked. I have an index card, I said. 7 rules, handwritten. Another pause, longer. Read them to me, she said. I read them. All 7. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for long enough that I checked the frequency indicator to make sure I hadn't lost her. He added 2, she said finally. Who did? Joel? Your uncle? The first 5 rules were there when I arrived in 1998. I don't know when they were written originally. Joel added 6 and 7. I looked at the card. 6 and 7, the guest log protocol, and the porch light. So the first 5 predate him, I said, by a long time, I think. I tried to trace them once. The earliest version I found was in a station document from 1974. But the document referenced them as existing protocol, which means they were already there. She said it matter-of-factly, the way someone reports a fact they've made peace with, because making a fuss about it stopped being useful a long time ago. Do you know what they're for? I asked. She paused again. This pause felt like choosing, like she was deciding how much of a shape to give to something she normally kept formless. I know what they kept me from doing, she said, for 12 years. She told me about Cutter's Hollow in the flat. Careful way of someone who has learned that the right tone is the only thing standing between information and panic. Removed from current park maps in 1987. She'd found the removal documentation in a district records request, a memo recommending the hollow be excluded from public-facing cartography following a series of SAR incidents between 1981 and 1986. 5 incidents. No bodies recovered from any of them. No explanation in the memo for why no bodies were recovered. The memo didn't use the word disappeared. It said, subjects not located, 5 times, 5 separate incidents over 5 years. 5 times the SAR teams went into that hollow and came back without whoever they'd gone in to find. After 1986, no documented SAR operations had entered Cutter's Hollow. The station itself had been built in 1962. The first version of the rules, or the oldest version she'd found, appeared in the station supplemental log in 1971. She'd found it during her 2nd year at the post, in a document she hadn't been told existed. The rules work, she said. I followed them for 12 years, and nothing happened to me that I couldn't walk away from. But you transferred, I said. I transferred because I realized that following the rules wasn't only protecting me. I didn't say anything. I waited. It's patient, she said. Whatever it is, it doesn't force things. It waits to see what you'll do, and then it adjusts. Following the rules gives it data. I kept following the rules, and I kept giving it data. And after 12 years, I decided I was more useful to it than it was threatening to me. And that was worse than being scared. The frequency hummed between us. Finish your rotation, she said. Don't put in for a repeat posting. Don't try to investigate the hollow. Just follow the rules. Finish and leave. My uncle arranged this posting, I said. He left the same week I arrived. I know, she said. You knew about Joel? She paused, and in that pause was everything she wasn't going to say on a radio frequency. Why do you think he got you the job? She said. I sat with the handset in my lap for a long time after she signed off. The frequency hissed. The repeater clicked outside. The afternoon light was coming through the west window at a low angle, throwing a long rectangle of gold across the cabin floor. and it was very beautiful, and I didn't look at it. I had come to this posting because Joel called in a favor, because he thought of me, because after years of distance and the particular difficulty of being the nephew of a man who didn't know how to be close to people, he had reached out with something concrete. A job, a posting, a real opportunity, and I had understood it as an extension of care. As Joel saying, in the way Joel said things, that he thought I was capable of something. Diane's question sat in the middle a bit of that understanding and took it apart. Not maliciously, just precisely, the way a correct question does. Joel had spent 3 years at that station. He had read the supplemental log. I would find his entries in it later, and they would tell me more than I wanted to know. He understood what was in Cutter's Hollow well enough to write 2 additional rules and tape them on an index card rather than add them to the official protocol. He had requested a transfer. And then, before leaving, he had arranged for his nephew to arrive. I thought about what Diane said, that following the rules gave it data, that it was patient, that it adjusted based on what it observed. I thought about Joel's word choice. Follow these. Not you'll need these. Not be careful. Not any of the things a person says when they hand someone a document out of genuine protective concern. Just follow these. I didn't eat dinner that night. I checked the shed lock secure, and I checked the log, and I read Rule 1 twice, and I went to bed early because I needed the sleep, and because staying awake wasn't going to change the arithmetic of what I was beginning to understand. Whatever Joel had done, he had done it believing I would be all right. I kept telling myself that. It was the only version of the story I could get through the night on. The repeater clicked. I listened to it until I slept. I found it on day 8, looking for something else. I was pulling the personnel binder to check the format for a trail report, and the binder had shifted on the shelf, settled crooked against the shelf backing. And when I straightened it, I felt something behind it. Another book. Spiral bound, narrower than the binder, pushed flat against the shelf backing as though someone had put it there, intending it to be found only by someone who went looking in the right way. The label on the cover was handwritten on a strip of white tape. Station OPS Supplemental. Below that, a date range, 1971-2. The closing year was blank. I took it to the table. The paper was the cheap kind that yellows fast. The first pages were amber at the edges. The ink faded to brown. The first entry was dated October 14th, 1971, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Small, cramped, the handwriting of someone who wrote a lot and had learned to make it efficient. Voice from the North Hollow, approximately 0200 hours. Calling the name of the operator's wife. Operator did not exit station. Incident logged here rather than official record per verbal instruction of district supervisor. I read the sentence about the district supervisor 3 times per verbal instruction, which meant someone in that office had told a ranger in 1971 not to put it in the official log, which meant the district had known about the North Hollow and the voices since at least 1971, and had spent 50 years ensuring none of it appeared in any record that could be formally requested. The supplemental log was what the rangers kept for each other. The honest record that traveled between postings in the gap behind the personnel binder. I turned the page. I read the full supplemental log that afternoon. It took 3 hours. I didn't stop for water. The pattern was consistent across 50 years of entries in more than a dozen different hands. Voice from the north, using a name that meant something to the current operator. The voices always chose correctly. They weren't random. They were whoever the operator would most want to hear. A wife, a mother, a friend from the academy, a brother. Always in the prohibited hours, always patient, always using the name correctly. The shed had been found unlocked 11 times across the log's history. The objects inside, described briefly by multiple operators, were different each time, but the nature of them was consistent. Things that had belonged to previous rangers. Personal objects, professional objects, accumulated. The repeater silence was logged 17 times. In every account, the operator who stayed inside and didn't speak heard movement around the exterior. In every account, the clicking eventually resumed. In every account, the operator noted that the silence felt intentional. The repositioned trail markers appeared in the log going back to 1978. Always on the North Ridge Spur. Always pointing toward Cutter's Hollow. 2 entries in the log simply stopped. The first was in 1983. An operator named Garrison had been logging consistently, professional, detailed. His entries showed he was treating the supplemental log seriously as documentation. His last entry was November 2nd, 1983. It described the voice from the north, calling his father's name, the night hours, the deliberation. It ended mid-sentence, not at the end of the page. Mid-sentence, the pen trailing off. The next entry was dated November 19th, 1983, in a completely different hand, with no reference to Garrison at all. The second was 2004. An operator named Reyes. Same pattern. Entries stopping abruptly. The next entry made no mention of her. I found their names in the district's official personnel records later, or rather, I found that their names weren't in the district's official personnel records. No transfer notation, no end of service record, no next posting, just absent from the record. The way a cut page is absent from a log, leaving only the edge. Joel's section of the supplemental log started in the fall of his first year at the station and ran to 2 weeks before I arrived. His handwriting was familiar, the small, precise hand I recognized from birthday cards and field report copies he'd sent me over the years. His tone was different from the other operators, where Garrison and Reyes and the others wrote with the controlled language of people trying to document something they were frightened of. Joel wrote analytically. He cataloged behaviors. He noted patterns. He tried to identify the selection logic for the marker repositioning which trail, which markers, at what intervals, and drew small maps in the margins. His entries felt like the work of someone who had decided that understanding the thing was safer than being afraid of it. In his second year, he began using the word subject to refer to what was in the hollow. In his third year, his entries became less frequent, but longer. More considered, like someone whose relationship to a problem has shifted from active investigation to something closer to accommodation. His final entry was dated 2 weeks before my start date. I read it standing up because I couldn't sit down for it. I have requested transfer. My request has been approved. I have arranged for a replacement operator who is not familiar with the station's history. I believe that proximity to a known family member creates a more stable observational environment for the subject. It demonstrates pattern recognition across social networks rather than only geographic ones, and may allow for more productive documentation of its behavioral range. I have given the replacement a current version of the protocol card. I have added rules 6 and 7 based on patterns I documented in years 2 and 3. I may be wrong about the stability hypothesis. I have added Rule 7 specifically because I was not wrong about the departure behavior. The replacement arrives October 14th. I am leaving the porch light on. I set the log down on the table. I picked it back up and read the entry again. Then I put it in the shelf behind the personnel binder, exactly where I'd found it. And I went and stood in the middle of the main room for a while without doing anything in particular. He had called it a stability hypothesis. He had called me a replacement operator. He had documented my arrival date 2 weeks before I got there and filed it in the supplemental log that he knew I would find because he had found it the same way, and he knew what I would do when I found something I was told not to look for. The porch light had been burning when I arrived. He had left it on. I may be wrong about the stability hypothesis. That was the sentence I kept returning to. Not an apology, not a justification, just the one small place where his certainty cracked and let something else through. I don't know if it helped. I don't know if it was supposed to. Morning of day 8. I did the Northridge Spur on the early patrol, partly because it was due for inspection, and partly because I wanted to see the marker I had adjusted on day 2 to see if it had been moved again. It had. All 3 markers on the spur had been moved. Not subtly wrong this time, not 45 degrees off alignment. All 3 posts were turned to face directly toward Cutter's Hollow, precise, intentional arrow discs pointing north-northeast into the unmapped hollow, like they'd been calibrated. If a hiker followed those markers in sequence, they would walk off the maintained trail and into the hollow without understanding they'd left the trail system. I photographed all 3, logged the coordinates, did not touch them. I stood at the 3rd marker and did the calculation. There were 2 active backcountry permits in the system for this week. The couple from Knoxville I'd spoken to on day 2, and a solo hiker who'd signed in 2 days ago for a 4-night loop. Both permits had routes that included the Northridge Spur. If either of them had come through the spur yesterday or this morning before I'd arrived, they would have followed these markers. The arrow on the first post pointed directly into the hollow. The trail that followed that pointing would not be obvious. There was a deer path there. I could see it, worn enough to read as a maintained trail to someone who was tired and trusting the markers. Rule 5 said, "Do not follow. Return to the station." I turned around and walked back down the spur to the main trail junction, and then back to the station. And with every step, I did the arithmetic of what I was choosing. The Knoxville couple was experienced and well-equipped, and had been on that trail before. The solo hiker's permit listed 10 years of backcountry. experience in the Smokies. By the time I got back to the station, I had almost convinced myself they were fine. Almost. The shed lock was open when I got back, not broken. The hasp was down, the padlock hanging open, the combination dial spun to 0, reset, as though someone had opened it with the correct combination and then reset the dial as a courtesy. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I went inside the cabin, keyed the radio, and reported to the district office. District, Desolate Ridge, reporting a Rule 3 situation at the equipment shed. Lock is open, unbroken. Requesting someone come up. Over. A pause. Copy, Desolate Ridge. We'll send someone when we have availability. Maintain position outside the shed. Over. Copy. What's the ETA? When we have availability. Maintain position. District out. I sat outside the shed on an overturned gear bucket for 4 hours. The morning went by. The midday light came straight down through the canopy gap above the shed roof. A nuthatch worked its way down the trunk of the nearest hemlock, upside down, methodical. The repeater clicked. The forest made its normal sounds. Nobody came up the fire road. At 2:15 p.m., I went inside the shed. The equipment was undisturbed. The chainsaws, the trail tools, the emergency gear in its labeled bins, the fuel cans in their correct positions. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the east interior wall. Along the base of the east wall, arranged in a straight line, with approximately 6 inches between each item, was a collection. A ranger's bootlace, brown, the aglet on one end missing. A child's compass, the cheap kind, plastic housing, a bluebird on the dial face. The needle was turning slowly in the shed's cool air. A torn permit stub, the carbon copy layer. A name on it I couldn't fully read. The first letter was a P, the rest smeared. A ranger name badge, metal pin back, the Park Service emblem, the name field. Prentice. A folded piece of notebook paper with nothing written on it. When I unfolded it, both sides were blank. The fold lines were old, deeply creased. I photographed everything. I did not touch any of it. I backed out of the shed, reset the lock with a new combination, and wrote the new combination on a different card that I kept in my boot. I stood outside in the afternoon and looked at the tree line and thought about the name badge. Prentice. I thought about Garrison. I thought about Reyes. I thought about the entry in the supplemental log that had stopped mid-sentence in 1983, and whose author had vanished from the district's personnel records as completely as a cut page from a log. I was on the porch at 6:10 p.m., watching the light go orange, when the clicking stopped. Not slowed, not degraded, just one click, and then nothing. I was inside the cabin in 6 seconds. I did not speak. I went to the table and sat in the chair that faced the door and put my hands flat on the table. The silence from the repeater was total and specific. You didn't realize how present the clicking had been until it was gone. The absence of it changed the whole acoustic character of the station, made the forest sounds louder, made the cabin feel thinner-walled. At 6:14 p.m., I heard footsteps on the east side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. Not the scurrying weight shift of a deer or the heavy random placement of a bear. Something walking in a measured way, at a human pace, along the east exterior wall. The footsteps moved from south to north along the east wall. They stopped at the east window. I could see the window from where I sat. The last of the daylight was coming through it, dropping fast. Nothing was visible in the frame, no silhouette, no shadow. But the footsteps were present. Whatever was at that window was standing below the frame line, or standing in a way that produced no silhouette against the fading sky. I did not speak. I did not move. My hands stayed flat on the table because if I lifted them, they would shake, and I didn't want to hear them shake. I sat there for 32 minutes by my watch. At 6:42 p.m., the footsteps moved again. Back south along the east wall, then nothing. Silence of a different quality, the silence of something that had left. At 6:44 p.m., the clicking resumed. It was only afterward, writing in the log, that I registered what the timing meant. Whatever had been at the window had left before the clicking came back. It had anticipated the clicking's return. It had known it was about to resume, which meant the silence wasn't a malfunction. The silence was a choice. Something that could stop the sound could also start it again. The equipment box on that tower wasn't producing the clicking through any process I could explain with what I knew about relay hardware. Something was making the sound, and something had decided that evening that 32 minutes of a man sitting in silence with his hands on a table was enough. I read Rule 4 again after I wrote the log entry. I read it very carefully. The radio repeater tower makes a clicking sound during normal operation. Normal operation. I thought about what that phrase was doing in that sentence. I thought about who had written it first, in 1971, and what they had understood when they wrote it. The day before my last night, I pulled every red tabbed page from the visitor log. 11 pages. 3 from the current season, 8 from prior seasons, stored in the archive box under the front desk. I laid them out on the table in chronological order, oldest to most recent, and read each second entry carefully. The physical descriptions were meticulous. Height to within an inch. Hair color noted with the specific vocabulary of someone who paid careful attention. Not just brown, but dark brown, fine, worn loose. Gait patterns described with the kind of detail that suggested observation from a distance over time. Slight favoring of left foot, consistent with old ankle injury or habit. Clothing described by layer. Weight estimated within a range. And in the face field, on every single entry across every season, did not look directly at. Not face obscured, not poor lighting, not visitor declined description. The same 4 words with the same phrasing, every time. As though the entry was made by something that understood the protocol well enough to fill in every required field except one, and chose the same words for that exception each time because they were accurate. The most recent red tab entry stopped me. The date was 3 weeks before my start date. The station had been unoccupied between Joel's departure and my arrival, a gap of 18 days. No ranger on site. No permitted visitors during that window, because the station was officially between operators, and the backcountry permit system shows an unstaffed gap for that sector. But someone had opened the visitor log and made an entry. The date field, the correct date, 3 weeks prior. the name field, a dash, the permit field, blank. The physical description, detailed, specific height, build, clothing, gait. Face field, did not look directly at. And at the bottom of the entry, in the comments field that rangers used for notes about the contact, a field that visitors didn't normally fill in, at all 7 words. New operator arriving October 14th. Noted for continuity. October 14th was my start date. I looked at that date for a long time. It had logged my arrival before I arrived. It had used the word continuity, a record-keeping term, an archivist's term, and it had placed the entry in the comments field that belonged to the ranger, not the visitor, as though it understood which role it was playing in the protocol. I added a red tab to the page. Then I sat back in my chair and understood, for the first time, not what I was dealing with, but what I was to it. I was a data point, an expected entry, something that had already been noted for continuity in a record that I was only now reading. I had been in this log before I arrived. I turned the porch light on at sundown. Rule 7. I did it without deliberation, just reached up and clicked the switch as the last orange light dropped below the ridge. And then I went inside and sat at the table with the log open and the card beside it, and waited. The evening was clear, temperatures in the low 30s, the kind of cold that makes the forest very still. No wind, nothing moving. At 11:47 p.m., the voice came from the north. Joel's voice, my name. Patient, measured, the interval of 30 seconds between each call that I had logged on night 4. I had the log open. I wrote the time, the bearing, the duration. My handwriting was even. My hand was steady. I had practiced this enough that the procedure was reflex now. And the reflex was a useful thing to have because it gave me somewhere to put my attention that was not the voice itself. It called for 20 minutes. Then it stopped. At 12:34 a.m., someone knocked on the front door. 3 knocks. The same interval as the woman 9 days ago. Measured, patient, not urgent. I read Rule 2. Rule 2 covered someone arriving after dark and asking to use the radio. It didn't cover knocking, it assumed entry. It assumed the person was inside. I was sitting with a rule that didn't precisely apply to a situation that felt like it was testing whether I could extrapolate. I got up from the table. I positioned myself between the interior of the cabin and the door. The spirit of Rule 2 applied to the door rather than the visitor. I stood there. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, same spacing. I did not answer. At 12:38 a.m., the knocking stopped. I stood at the door for another 10 minutes, breathing shallowly, listening to the porch boards. Nothing. No footsteps retreating down the steps. Just the transition from knocking to silence, with no interval of movement in between. I went back to the table. I wrote in the log, 0034 hours. Knocking at front door, 3 count, 2 intervals. Did not answer. Sound cessation at 0038 without audible departure. Rules 1 and 2 applied in combination. Then I wrote, it is finding the edges of the rules. Then I crossed that out, because I didn't know how to explain it professionally, and because crossing it out felt like the only thing I had any control over just then. At 1:14 a.m., I looked out the east window at the porch light. It was standing at the tree line. The porch light threw a cone of yellow light about 30 feet from the cabin wall, far enough to catch the first rank of trees and the 10 feet of cleared ground in front of them. It stood at the edge of that light, at the place where the yellow glow met the dark of the tree line, so that it was both illuminated and at the boundary of not being illuminated. The shape of a man, the height of a man, standing still with the posture of a man who is waiting, not hiding, upright, forward-facing, no attempt at concealment. I looked at it for a long time before I was certain what I was seeing. The light was imperfect. I told myself, for the first 30 seconds, that it was a tree, a shadow, a trick of the yellow porch light against the dark canopy. Then it shifted its weight, almost imperceptibly, and I knew it wasn't any of those things. I did not turn off the light. Rule 7. I stayed at the window. It did not move again. I stood at the window and watched it stand at the tree line for 3 hours and 7 minutes. I know the exact duration because I logged every 15 minutes. 0114, subject present, tree line, no movement. 013. Oh, subject present, no movement. 15-minute entries in the log, all night, my handwriting getting slightly less even as the hours went by, but staying legible because I needed it to be legible. Needed the act of writing to be a thing I was doing rather than something I had stopped doing. At 4:21 a.m., past the 4 a.m. threshold of Rule 1, it stepped back into the tree line and was gone. Not dramatically, just a single step backward into the dark. And then the tree line was only the tree line. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Then I noticed the silence. The repeater had stopped clicking. I didn't know when, sometime in the 3 hours of watching the window, the clicking had stopped. And I had not noticed because my attention had been entirely on the shape in the light. I stood in the silent cabin and understood what had happened. The repeater silence and the figure at the tree line were simultaneous. While I watched one, the other thing, whatever produced the footsteps, whatever stood at windows, had been doing something else, moving somewhere. The figure in the light was where I was supposed to look. The clicking resumed at 4:24 a.m. 3 minutes. It had 3 minutes of my divided attention. I stood at the window until full dawn and tried to calculate what 3 minutes was worth and what it had done with them, and whether I would ever know. I sat with Joel's supplemental log entries for the last time on the morning of my departure, reading them differently than I had before. Not looking for what he felt, reading for what he understood. Joel had spent 3 years trying to categorize a behavior. He'd mapped the marker repositioning patterns, the intervals of the voice calls, the timing of the shed events. He'd noted which rules had payoffs and when. He'd tried to find a predictive logic. If this behavior, then that response. Stimulus and reaction. Cause and effect. He was doing what any competent ranger does when confronted with something that doesn't match existing protocol, trying to bring it inside a framework he already had. But in his 3rd year, his entries shifted. He stopped writing about what it did and started writing about what it kept. The objects in the shed, the guest log entries, the supplemental log itself. He'd noted in his 2nd year that he believed it had read the supplemental log. How he knew this, he didn't explain directly, But he wrote, "Entries appear to have been reviewed. Order disturbed, in a way inconsistent with my own handling." Something had read the honest record kept by 50 years of rangers. And then, in a marginal note in his 3rd year, in handwriting smaller than his usual hand, as though he was writing it quietly, "It is doing what we do. It is keeping records." The shed objects were not trophies. They were not warnings. They were documentation, a collection of artifacts organized by an entity that had been observing this station for half a century, the way the station observed the park. It had its own log, its own visitor records, its own archive of the operators who had come through, arranged along the east wall of a shed with 6 inches of careful space between each item. The guest log entries were its check-in documentation. The voice calls were its field observations, testing responses, logging outcomes, building a behavioral profile of each new operator across the duration of their posting. The rules, which had been written to contain it, had become the protocol it mirrored. It followed them as precisely as we did, and following them had taught it more about the station, about what humans did under specific constraints, about what they chose, about what they protected, and what they sacrificed, than any amount of physical observation could have. I thought about Diane's words. I kept giving it data, and after 12 years, I decided I was more useful to it than it was threatening to me. She hadn't said that as a comfort. She'd said it as a warning about what kind of threat it actually was. Not predation, documentation. It was building something, and we had been helping it, rule by rule, for 50 years. I opened the supplemental log to the first blank page after Joel's final entry and picked up a pen. I sat with it for a moment. Then I wrote, "Operator, Callum Voss. Posting, October 14th to November 1st. This entry is my contribution to the record I found behind the personnel binder. I'm writing it because I think the record matters, and because the ranger who finds this next deserves more than I had going in." I wrote what I'd experienced, the voice on night 4, the hiker who came for the radio and didn't use it, the shed and its contents, the repeater silence, the figure in the porch light, the red tab entries in the visitor log, and what the most recent one had said. Then I wrote what I believed. It is following the same rules we are. I think Joel understood this in his 3rd year, and it changed how he related to it. He went from trying to document a threat to trying to understand a parallel operation. I don't know if that shift was rational, or if it was a kind of accommodation that felt like clarity. Maybe both. The rules aren't only protection. I think they're a shared protocol, a language that emerged over 50 years between the station and whatever is in the hollow. Following the rules gives it data and gives us safety, and I'm not sure which side of that arrangement benefits more. Diane followed them for 12 years and left because she saw clearly what I am only seeing now at the end. Joel followed them for 3 years and then made a decision I'm still trying to understand. I'm not going to pretend I've resolved it. I haven't. The rules work. I'm alive. I'm leaving. That's what I know. If you're reading this, follow the rules. Read the whole log before you make any decisions. Don't go into the hollow. Don't assume the district office will help you understand this. They'll confirm you're safe and disconnect. Leave the porch light on your last night. Don't turn it off regardless of what you see in it. That's Rule 7. And Joel added it for a reason I now understand. Whatever it is, it's been here longer than the station. Probably longer than the park. It isn't leaving. We rotate through. It stays. Keep good records. So will it. I closed the log. I put it behind the personnel binder in the position I'd found it, and I straightened the binder in front of it, and I put the chair back exactly where it had been. I loaded my truck in the gray 6 a.m. light, the frost still white on the cleared ground around the cabin, my breath visible in the cold air. The porch light was still burning. It had burned all night. And it was burning now, in the pale morning, looking faintly orange against the daylight, the way artificial light does when the sky is bright enough to compete with it. I did not turn it off. I closed the cabin door and checked the shed lock secure. My new combination. The old one gone. I did a final walk of the exterior, the professional habit of a last day inspection, and everything was in order, and nothing was out of place, and the tree line was just the tree line in the morning light, bare branches and hemlock, and the gray-brown of late-season deciduous hardwood. I got in the truck. I drove the 7-mile fire road without looking in the mirror for the first 3 miles. The road was rough from recent rain, and I needed to watch the soft spots on the shoulder, the low branch on the left at mile 4, the gravel wash at mile 6. I needed reasons not to look back, and the road provided them. At mile 3, I looked. The ridge was visible in the mirror, the spine of it against the October sky, the ridgetop canopy that was mostly bare now, the antenna of the repeater tower, just visible above the tree line if you knew what to look for. No smoke, no movement. Just the ridge, and the tower, and the faint orange point of the porch light still burning. I drove on. At the fire road gate, I stopped, got out, and locked it per procedure. Steel cable through the barrier post, combination lock, test the lock, noted in the field log on my clipboard. Standard. I did it the same way I'd have done it on any posting. I stood at the gate for a moment with my hand on the cable. Joel's final supplemental log entry. I believe proximity to a known family member creates a more stable observational environment for the subject. The word believe. The word may and I may be wrong. The one crack in the analytical language where something human had gotten through. I thought about calling him. I'd thought about it every day for 2 weeks and hadn't done it. I still wasn't ready. I wasn't sure what I would say, or what I needed him to say back, or whether there was a version of the conversation that would resolve anything in a way that I could live with. I got back in the truck. I drove down the mountain. The Smokies fell away behind me in the mirror ridge after ridge, the blue-gray haze that gives the mountains their name, the valley opening up below. Beautiful. Enormous. Indifferent in the way that places are when they have been there much longer than anything you could name. The porch light would burn until the propane ran out. Maybe a week, maybe 2. And then the next operator would arrive, and the bulb would be cold, and they would start from the beginning without knowing what I knew, unless they found the log behind the personnel binder, which they would, because the log had been put there to be found by people who looked in the right way. and people who took this kind of posting were the kind of people who looked. I told myself that was enough. I drove home. That was 4 months ago. I've gone back and forth on whether to share this. Not because I'm worried about the station. The station has its protocols. The district office has its deliberate incuriosity. The supplemental log has the next ranger's name already written in it by whatever reads it between postings. The apparatus continues without me. I've been reluctant because telling it means the story is finished. And the story isn't finished. 3 weeks ago, my phone rang. Unknown number. Area code I didn't recognize. I looked it up later. It was a routing code associated with a cellular relay in Sevier County, Tennessee, which is the county that contains most of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I answered. No one spoke. I listened to 40 seconds of what I can only describe as a room. A small room with a particular acoustic quality, slightly reverberant, the way a cabin with low ceilings sounds when it's quiet. And underneath that room sound, faint but consistent and unmistakable, the clicking of a radio repeater running its irregular, almost patterned rhythm. Then the call ended. I've been trying to decide what to do with it since. There are no rules for this. The index card addressed the station, the hours, the shed, the tower, the trail markers, the light. Joel wrote rules for a defined geography, and I have left that geography, and the rules did not come with me. Whatever protocol existed up there on that ridge does not apply down here in my apartment with my phone on the kitchen table. I don't know why it called. I don't know what calling me outside the station means, whether it's an extension of the documentation, another data point being logged, or whether it means something has changed in the pattern. Whether it found me, or whether it has always known how to find me, and this is the first time it chose to. I'm telling this story because telling it is the only version of logging it that I have left. Because I spent 3 weeks learning to document what happened up there, and documentation is the only professional response I have to things I can't explain. I'm telling it because if there's a next operator at Desolate Ridge, I want them to know that Diane was right about what following the rules gives it. And Joel was right that there's a stability to the arrangement. And both of those things can be true, and neither of them is enough. I'm telling it because my phone is on the kitchen table right now, and the area code for Sevier County is a sequence of numbers I will recognize if I see it again, and I don't know what I'll do when I see it. I'm alive. I followed the rules. I kept the records. I left the porch light on.